And just as a note, the session is being recorded, so just for double verification on that. So before we begin the session, what I would like to do is I'd like to kind of introduce everyone, and then we'll start the paper. I'll try not to take too long on the introduction. So the first set of papers is going to, or my introductions will be for the paper presenter. So they're not in any order. I kind of just put it together. So the first paper presenter will be by Rory Gernhardt. He is currently a doctoral student in the Department of Economics at Northeastern University, specializing in labor and development economics. And he has a very strong interest in structures that perpetuate poverty. And he was kind enough to give background information for his co-author. And his first co-author is Silvia Prina. She's an associate professor of economics at Northeastern, who is a development economist understanding the behavior of poor households for the purpose of potential strategies to improve their lives. And his other co-author is Mindy Marks, and she's the associate professor of economics at Northeastern University, and she conducts research in applied economics with an emphasis on labor, health, and education topics. And she does an empirical economic analysis as well. And before she joined the faculty at Northeastern, she was an associate professor at University of California, Riverside. Well, Riverside is a pretty nice city, by the way. So if you ever get a chance, they have a lot of nice coffee houses. The next paper presenter will be Alexander Herzog-Stein. He is currently the master's degree economics in international economic studies, has a master's in science and economics, and PhD in economics. And I believe it looked like he studied at Maastricht University and University of Warwick. And since 2019, he's been an honorary professor at the University of Koblenz-Landau. And then for the final presenter is Elena, and she is an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. She earned her PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota in 2019. Along with her other colleagues, she does research in health economics, industrial organization, and housing. Now I'll turn it over to the discussants. So the first discussant will be Patrick Nurse. He is a fifth-year PhD student at Kiel University in the PhD Quantitative Economics program. He earned his bachelor's degree in social economics from University of Hamburg in Germany and economics at Linnaeus University in Sweden. And he's been an associate research chair of public economics at Kiel University. And then the next discussant will be Jennifer Kwok. She is an assistant professor of health policy and administration at the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Public Health. She received her PhD from University of California at Berkeley and was an Enber postdoctoral fellow in aging and health. So along with her other colleagues, she studied health economics and labor economics as well. And then the final discussion in the session will be, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Phanindra Wunnava. He's currently the David K. Smith 42 Chair in Applied Economics at Middlebury College in Vermont. He's a research fellow at IZA, which is the Institute of Study of Labor, located in Bonn, Germany. And he's also a fellow, like I am, at the Global Labor Organization as well. And he's trained under the noted labor economist Solomon Polachek at the State University of New York at Binghamton and received his PhD there. And like his other colleagues, he studied health economics, labor economics, and so on. So that's everything I have on my introduction. So I hope everyone is ready to begin. I'm ready to begin. So let's begin the first paper of the session. Let me check the online program. So The first paper is going to be by Roy Lewis Gernhardt, the 2018 Shutdown and SNAP Benefits Timing. Can food stamp recipients smooth consumption? So let's take it away, Roy. And
absolutely. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here.
yes, I can. Oh.
And from beginning. I like this little laser pointer. So the 2018 government shutdown and SNAP benefits timing and whether or not food stamp recipients can smooth consumption. This is a paper that my co-authors and I, Mindy Marks and Silvia Prina, as were already introduced, and we had fantastic research assistance by Redina Tahaj. A little bit of background here. The permanent income hypothesis states that we should expect transitory income changes to not affect consumption. Households should smooth consumption. The problem is that existing evidence contradicts that theory, especially in the context of the poor. There are a number of reasons that are postulated that may cause this. One of the primary ones are financial market imperfections. In other words, primarily their inability to receive credit when needed. Another that's often postulated are self-control issues. We're not going to get into the causes. We're just going to be looking at whether or not we can find evidence that supports or contradicts the PIH. And we're going to look at an unexpected transitory income change. And that's probably where our paper is the most different from what exists in this literature. It's a little harder to find unexpected transitory changes that can be studied. So we're going to take advantage of two sources of variation in the timing of the SNAP disbursement in early 2019 that were caused by the government shutdown. The first source of variation is federally mandated early distribution. So all of the households that would have received SNAP benefits during February end up receiving it early in January. And then the second thing we're going to look at is state variation. Because the states have different distribution schedules, they had to make changes in their March and April distributions in order to help the families smooth. And those changes create another set of variation that we're able to take advantage of. We're not going to talk about that today in any detail, simply in the interest of time. We're just going to focus on the first part. We're going to analyze the expenditures of 5,500 SNAP eligible households from the Nielsen data set in 2018 and 2019 and use that to study their ability to smooth. A quick preview of the findings are that there's about a 9.6% reduction in expenditures in the last week of February 2019 among the SNAP eligible households compared to other normal months in 2018 and 2019. When we use the state variation, we find corroborating evidence, and here we can calculate that each day of an accelerated payment will be associated with a 1.25% decrease in spending during the last 7 days of the month. And so how that's working is that when the payment is accelerated, that means, of course, that time period in the last week of the month, it's been longer since they've received any SNAP benefits. A quick primer on the SNAP program. Stands for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and that pretty much explains what it is. It's run by the USDA for low-income families, and there are national eligibility standards for gross income and family size. The program is administered, however, at the state level, and there is some variation among the states. Most importantly for our purposes is there's variation in the distribution timing. There is also some variation in the secondary qualification and eligibility questions, and definitely variation in outreach by the state, and therefore variation in participation rates among eligible families. The SNAP benefits are definitely an important part of household income. We estimate in our sample that the median eligible household should be receiving around $192 per month in benefits on about a $1,200 a month income. So that's almost a 16% income boost. This is not a trivial amount of money coming into these household budgets. The occasion for our natural experiment is the federal government shutdown in late 2018. What happened is, starting on December 22nd, the federal government shut down because of an impasse on the border wall. And this became quickly the longest federal shutdown in US history, and is still to date. Within 2 weeks, there were major news organizations reporting that SNAP recipients were likely to miss one or more SNAP payments because there was, the government was shut down, there was no budget for them. The administration took note, and in so doing, they found a little bit of a loophole. There had been a House continuing resolution that passed for funding that allowed the SNAP program to be funded as long as the payment, up until January 20th. So what the USDA told everybody to do was to accelerate their February payments to before January 20th in order to get those payments into that resolution. So they slid $5 billion of spending basically forward. All of the states responded to this by saying, yep, we want to be part of that. It was in essence a mandate. If the state wanted the money, they had to do this. They had to accelerate their February payment. And so the February payments occurred between January 14th and January 20th. And so what this did for a family who was receiving SNAP benefits, it created a short-term windfall. That is, their January payment and February payment were right next to each other. And then it was followed by a longer than normal gap, during which time they received no SNAP disbursements. This visualization has a lot going on, but it allows you to see what happens with the variation. So right here in panel A, we have the first 4 months of 2018. Column 1 is January, column 2 is February, and then we have March and April. And in panel B, we're looking at the same first 4 months in 2019 so that we can compare. This green hash is simply highlighting February. These pink vertical bars are highlighting the last week in March and April, which are the important time frame we're going to be analyzing in the second part of the paper, dealing with state variation, which again, like I said, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about in the interest of time. Each row is a state. So let's focus on Alabama here. Alabama normally distributes their SNAP benefits between, looks like the 3rd or 4th day of the month here. And then this looks like it's going to about the 23rd of the month. So this is their distribution window. Within that period, every SNAP household is going to receive their benefits on the same day every month, okay? So if you are a household that typically gets your, in January of 2018, gets your SNAP benefits, let's say on the 20th, then you're also going to get it on February the 20th and March 20th and April 20th under normal circumstances. And where you fall in that window is a pseudo-random process. The states use, it's done differently in each state, but it ends up having the same basic effect. It's like things like the last number of the Social Security, or the last number of the SNAP identification number, or the first letters in the last name. Now, if we look across here at Alabama, well, and let's do a quick comparison here. Let's say we compare Alabama, where we have this broad window, and we have North Dakota. Here, everybody who receives SNAP in North Dakota receives it on the 1st of the month. Now, if we look across, we see everything's normal through 2018. We jump over here to 2019, and we see January has this normal distribution window, and the February payment has been advanced. And we can see in this column in red, that bar is the time period during which all of the accelerated February payments were paid. And so we could see in Alabama that there are some households who are receiving their January payment after their February payment. And you can see how we have this bunching of payments. That's the short-term windfall. And we can see this long drought where nobody is receiving any payments in February. And you can also see very clearly how March is very different because it has a much more compressed, across many of the states, it has a much more compressed distribution window compared to normal. And even like, for instance, in Alabama, you'll see here that even April is compressed. The data that we're going to use comes from the Nielsen Homescan surveys. Nielsen has about 60,000 panelists. It's a panel that rotates through attrition. As families drop out, Nielsen is always encouraging new families to join. And it's in the 48 continental United States. For each shopping trip, the panelists are going to scan all the barcodes of all the retail items that come into the home. And therefore, we have daily spending at the household level. Nielsen also gives us limited household demographics. And we're going to use those demographics to impute SNAP eligibility by overlaying Nielsen's income bins and household size onto the USDA's gross income limits for household sizes. Our estimation strategy is our outcome variable here is total spending for SNAP eligible households at a given time. And then our variable of interest is this interaction term we call no benefit. And that's simply the variable, it's multiplying February and 2019. So it's a indicator variable for February and an indicator variable for 2019. And looking at expenditures over the course of the month of February, we do find that there is a decrease. In here, we can see a decrease of $29.52 on spending over the month of February. And that is on an average expenditure of $516. So that's about a 5.7% decrease in spending in February. And these two columns, the difference is this one has no demographic controls. The second column has demographic controls. As you can see, the point estimates don't even change. So that's evidence that we probably don't have omitted variables that are causing trouble. But there's an extra trick we can do here because the period that we're looking at expenditures can change. And we would expect that if households aren't able to smooth consumption, that the effect that we find will be more obvious at the end of the month. So our outcome variable, we're going to look at it now, not just monthly, but we're also going to look at the last 2 weeks of the month, and we're going to look at the last week of the month. And here are these results. In this column, we're going to see the first 2 weeks of the month and so we can see that in February 2019, there is an $8.41 decrease in spending, which corresponds to about a 3.25% decrease. But that doesn't rise to the level of statistical significance. During the last 2 weeks, however, that jumps up to an 8.2% decrease. And during the last week, that jumps up to a 9.6% decrease. And both of those are highly significant. So we do see what we would expect if the households are unable to smooth consumption. And that is that at the end of the month, these effects are concentrated. We perform 2 key robustness checks. The first one is to guard against confounds. We don't think there are any important confounds that are happening on the national level during this time frame. There are none of the other transfer programs were affected for various reasons, but none of them were affected by the shutdown. And the workers, for instance, that were on furlough, from the federal government. First of all, that's a very small percentage of the country's workforce. Second of all, almost all of them had incomes that were higher than the SNAP eligibility criteria, so they wouldn't have been in our sample. So we just don't think that there's confounds there. But this robustness check would help us see that if there were. And what we're going to do is the exact same estimation, but only on households that are just above the eligibility criteria. The second check that we're going to do is a placebo treatment. And this helps us see if we might have problems in our methodology. And we're going to simply pretend that the shutdown didn't occur in 2019, but instead occurred in 2018. So we're going to shift all of our data back a year, and we're going to see if we find results. Our results are reassuring for both of these placebo checks. Statistically, you can't tell the difference in either of our variables of interest here from 0. We even have the opposite sign on the point estimate with the fake shutdown. So that's good news. In conclusion, SNAP eligible households definitely reduced spending in February of 2019, and that reduction is concentrated in the latter part of the month when budget constraints are more severe. When we look at the state variation in April and March, we find that that also corroborates this. The actual effects on SNAP participating households should be larger than the numbers that we're estimating. We should have an attenuation bias. First reason why is because the participation rate is not 100%. The national estimated participation rate is about 82%. And so you have to look at our estimates as intent to treat, not treatment on the treated. Another reason why our estimates are going to be attenuated is that we're going to have in our sample a number of people a number of households who are not eligible, but we weren't able to see that because there are secondary eligibility criteria that we don't observe. So again, these are attenuated results. Our placebo checks check out. They show that the near eligible households are not affected, and they also show that looking at previous years has no effect. So our findings, they're inconsistent with the standard models of intratemporal choice, but they're consistent with the previous literature, which also shows problems, that there's inconsistencies with the standard models, such as the permanent income hypothesis, especially among the poor. So thank you guys very much. Any questions or comments? I'd like to open the floor.
Oh, thank you, Roy, for the presentation. So I'm still having camera issues. I don't know why, but anyway, I like to, if there's any quick questions before we proceed to the discussant. Okay, I guess we'll go to the discussant. Patrick, it's your time.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to discuss this interesting paper on the 2018 government shutdown and the net benefit timing. Yeah, as the presentation before, I will also focus on the first part of the paper. Even you definitely should read the full paper because the second part of differences in country timing is also pretty interesting and is consistent with the first findings. Yeah, a short summary, as you a few minutes ago saw, it's about an unexpected temporary income shock due to the SNAP benefit timing, or the change in or due to the government shutdown, the early transfers. And it's based on data from the Nielsen home scan panel, which is pretty interesting because I haven't heard about this before, and it looks like it's useful for quite a lot of interesting applications. And yeah, The main results are that we can see that the intertemporal or the consumption smoothing of low-income households is generally difficult. And we can see that transitory income shocks, which should not have an effect on consumption. And here, this low consumption is in February, especially at the end of February, where the period of the transfer was the longest time ago. And yeah, in general, I think the identification is quite interesting and looks pretty convincing for me, also the results. And as mentioned in the presentation, it's only an intent to treat effect, and we still see significant effects on consumption over difference in consumption over February. And yeah, I found two parts of the paper. When I read the paper, I was thinking about two aspects most of the time, and we're not able to shut them down even for a second. And one is probably slightly related to a threat to the identification strategy. I think it's pretty clear that it's unexpected that the consumption or the early transfer happened, which was also made pretty clear in the paper. I was wondering about an aspect which you also mentioned in the paper, which is the potential stocking of food directly after the initial transfer. So we could fear, or we could expect that households who fear that they could run into trouble with food during February buy more food during the January term or at the beginning of February to make sure that they have enough food over the entire February period. Of course, the analysis now focused on consumption in general, but from the SNAP benefit or SNAP transfer perspectives, it's probably most important to have an eye on food consumption. I wouldn't expect that this problem is too serious, as pointed out before, or as pointed out in the paper. It's well known from the literature that poor diet and lower calorie intakes happen when SNAP is not available. And I was wondering whether you could use the Nielsen panel to look into especially food consumption during February. And the great thing about the panel is it has millions of items, and you can put them into 10 different categories. And I was wondering whether an analysis based on food categories might be helpful for you. And therefore, yeah, the main idea is to test differences regarding consumption categories or food in general. Yeah, and is there difference regarding these food categories? I was thinking about, it might be interesting to look on food consumption only from one aspect. And the second one might be an idea to avoid potential critique based on food stocking, which could be that you try to focus or look at in your analysis how the consumption on more durable food categories might be, like frozen food. When you see an early increase in frozen foods, it might be that this is an indicator. Well, when we see an increase in this category and at an early point, it might be an indicator that we have a kind of food stocking for the end of February, even when we see lower consumption in the data. This was one idea. And another idea is not really related to this potential identification threat. It was more, I think, interesting from another perspective. I was wondering what more from this perspective, preferences for consumption of specific goods, as you pointed out, which is also focused in the literature, that people might have trouble to focus on the important aspects or have the right priorities. And therefore, I was wondering whether it would be interesting to compare the composition of the of the consumption bundle of this treated group compared to the other group, whether we can see that indeed in February overall there's a decrease in the share of food consumption. It could also be that that food consumption is constant, but other aspects decreased because I've an example, entertainment stuff or anything else that could have bought it in January and still use it during February. But this is more of a side aspect. And I'm not sure whether this might be a good idea, but I was also wondering about whether it's possible to make a joint analysis of the full consumption of January and February, because when we then do not see any difference in food consumption, this would also be, well, when we see no difference based on the sum of both months, this would also be a probable indicator for stopping up of food for the end of February. But that's a smaller idea. Yeah. And the last, also smaller point, since it's about SNAP and transfers to low income groups, I was wondering especially about how differences between groups might be of interest for you, just for some policy implications. In general, I'm aware of that the Nielsen panel has only limited information about the socio-demographic characteristics, but at least related to children and employment status, I was thinking it might be of interest because in an example, unemployed people might have more trouble with or have higher borrowing constraints compared to other groups, for example. And this might be probably an interesting side story you could include in your paper, but the current findings, I think, are already quite interesting and make up quite a good paper. And yeah, that's from my side. I hope there are some interesting comments for you.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick, for your feedback. I'll turn it over to Roy to see if he has any responses.
Absolutely. Well, I want to say thank you very much for your feedback. It was, first of all, cogent and also, I think, completely in line with what we're already thinking and where we're heading for future drafts of the paper. It's the heterogeneity analysis is a little challenging given the data set. And so part of the reason why we kind of cut the paper off for this current draft where we are is because we didn't want to get into anything that was overly speculative. So for instance, the 10 product categories, one of the things that's, I mean, it's clearly obvious in the data that we're going to have some difficulty because only about 70% of the family's purchases are actually categorized. So there's so 30% are uncategorized, and so that adds a whole nother set of noise. We have played with that data, and things look interesting, but again, it becomes so messy that we've not yet, gotten to the bottom of, what do we want to report, what do we not want to report. The January situation is also interesting because if you think about it naively, you would think that the household's retail expenditures should increase in January in proportion to how much it decreases in February, but it doesn't. If you think about that for a little longer, you realize that does make sense because SNAP does not cover, in general, it doesn't cover 100% of a family's food expenditures. So this windfall, that allows this extra money in January to at least be partially fungible. So the family can divert some of these funds to other things like car payments or rent or what have you. And so you wouldn't necessarily expect the family to spend 100% of that money on something that we can track in a retail environment in January. But what that also means is that adds another set of difficulties for the heterogeneity analysis. Good. And I know Mindy and Silvia are here. I don't know if either of them have any notes that they want to mention, or if anybody else has any other questions.
Oh, thank you very much for your response to Patrick. So I think we will go to the next paper. And the next, so thank you again, Roy, for your paper. And thank you, Patrick, for your comments. And the next paper is going to be Germany's labor markets in Corona distress, new challenges to safeguard employment. And the presenter will be Professor Alexander Herzog-Stein. So Professor Herzog-Stein, feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you. The paper I'm presenting to you is joint work with together with Patrick, with Ulrike Stein, which is at the same institute as I am, and Lennert Peede, who is at the University of Muenster. We are quite happy and would like to thank LERA for giving us the opportunity to present our research results today here at the LERA at Asai meeting 2022. What do we do in our paper? We analyze the measures of internal flexibility used in Germany in safeguarding employment in the coronavirus crisis until December 22. So we focus what is actually the first wave of the pandemic and the first part of the recovery in Germany. And up to now, we have experienced 4 waves of the pandemic, but we focus with our paper on this first wave, and we want to compare it with the attempts to safeguard employment during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, which was quite a success story in Germany and got international attention. The key questions we address in our paper are: was safeguarding employment a success story during the coronavirus crisis? What kind of instruments were used to achieve safeguarding employment during that period? And were there potential distributional income effects related to this use of these instruments of internal flexibility? The approach we apply in our paper is a business cycle analysis. So we compare different business cycle periods and we do a time series decomposition, and additionally we support it with descriptive evidence. Let me tell you a tale of 2 recessions. On the left side, you see the Great Recession, which I mentioned already was a big success story in Germany with respect to safeguarding employment. On the right, you see the coronavirus recession. I also should mention at that point, whereas it was very easy to determine the time period of the Great Recession with the way we use it. We use Hodrick-Prescott filter to extract the trend, and then we look at deviations from this trend, and we determine also the peak and the trough of these recessions with the help of the Hodrick-Prescott filter. This determination of the recession is not so easy for coronavirus recession. It might be easier for other countries, but in Germany you have this specificity that actually there was already a slowdown in economic activity, mainly focused in the industrial sectors, which still play a major role in Germany, starting at the end of 2017. And so our method, which we applied here, comes to the conclusion that actually the peak of the economic activity, means with GDP growth, was already reached in the 4th quarter of 2017, even though, of course, that was not related to anything which has something to do with the COVID pandemic. So the coronavirus recession was transformed or let me formulate it differently. The COVID-19 pandemic transformed, in the German case, an economic slowdown into an economic crisis, and we have to take into account that in our analysis. But if we first look at these pictures, and as I said, these are deviations from trend, then you can see that if we look first at the Great Recession, there was a marked reduction in output as a consequence of the Great Recession by more than 8 log points. And this reduction in output was mainly covered by reductions in working time and productivity. So we have a pro-cyclical pattern of productivity in Germany, typical thing for labor hoarding. And as you can see, there was nearly no effect on employment. So during the Great Recession, the combination of a reduction in working time and productivity was able to prevent a large number of layoffs as a consequence of this marked economic slowdown. If we look at the coronavirus recession differently, then you can see there's a long period where we see this slowdown in economic activity. But if we focus then mainly starting from the fourth quarter of 2019, then you see a really marked decline in output. But this time we see a much stronger reaction in the reduction of working hours than in the reduction of productivity. So reduction in working hours played a much more important role than the classical labor hoarding argument. And also differently to the Great Recession, you can see that employment was not completely saved during the coronavirus recession, simply to the effect that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic was too severe with respect to its labor market effects to completely prevent any reductions in aggregate employment. As I said already, you have seen working time reductions were much more significant during the coronavirus crisis and recession than during the Great Recession, even though it was already important there. So it's quite interesting to look at the specific instruments, working time instruments, which were used to achieve the safeguarding of employment. And interestingly, if you first look at the two left columns, then you can see a pattern that during the Great Recession, several instruments played an important role in safeguarding employment. First to mention working time accounts, which is a specific instrument of working time flexibility we have in Germany, which is a bit like a savings account, but for working hours on company levels. Short time work, which is quite internationally known already. And then reductions in paid and unpaid overtime and reductions due to collective agreements, temporary reductions in regular working hours. They all played a major role during the Great Recession. However, the picture is different when we look at the coronavirus recession, and even more severe, more different if we look at the coronavirus crisis, looking at the period from the fourth quarter of 2019 to 2020 second quarter. Now short-time work dominates, and what you can see, and I haven't mentioned it before, this is the reduction in cyclical hours. So in the coronavirus recession, actually the use of short-time work reduced average quarterly working hours per employee by 18 hours. That's approximately half of a working week in Germany, and all the other instruments contributed a bit, working time accounts as well as overtime, but especially with respect to working time accounts, not comparable in magnitude to the Great Recession. So the dominant instrument of internal flexibility during the coronavirus recession, in contrast to the Great Recession, is this time short-time work. And this was also very early of the COVID-19 pandemic, decided by the government that they wanted to support short-time work on a much larger scale, especially because they were aware that, in contrast to historical patterns in Germany, where short-time work was mostly used by larger companies in the industrial sector, this time it was necessary that short-time work would have, as an instrument, had to be picked up by companies in the services sector, which was severely hit by the COVID pandemic, and to make safeguarding employment again a success story in this recession. If you look at the sectoral decomposition of short-time work, then you can see they achieved that. In general, we can see that nearly all sectors used short-time work much more extensively than during the Great Recession, which is the blue bars. The orange bars are in general significantly higher. So short-time work was in the sectors used more extensively, and especially in the service sectors. However, that's only one thing to recognize. Apart from the share that there are a larger number of workers who for whom the instrument short-time work was used, what we can see additionally, that compared to the Great Recession, in the coronavirus crisis, short-time work along the intensive dimension was also used much more than in the past. That is, the reduction in working hours caused by short-time work was over all sectors nearly markedly higher than in the coronavirus crisis. So we can summarize that in all the sectors, more workers had to work short-time work, and more hours were reduced due to short-time work in the coronavirus crisis compared to the Great Recession. However, given that short-time work in Germany works that for the numbers you do not have to work due to short-time work, you receive approximately 60 to 67%, depending whether there are children in the household or not, of your net income. It is clear that short-time work is paid by employers as well as by employees in a way, because employers have to still contribute normally, or have to pay the social security payments to social insurance for the hours not worked on their own. Normally they are shared between workers and employers. And as you can see, for the hours not worked, workers receive a lower compensation than they normally would receive. So that was always a feature which German economists or German social scientists thought made short-time work quite attractive. We have to say that in general, also the government also can change the rules during crisis to make the use of short-time work more attractive, and they did that significantly during the coronavirus crisis. For example, by deciding that employers didn't have to pay the social security contributions for the hours not worked due to short-time work, which made it financially much more attractive for employers to agree on the use of short-time work. However, with risk given that we this time observed a pattern that more people were in short-time work in sectors which normally in the past haven't used short-time work, especially in the services sector, and additionally, short-time work was used more intensively. This has implications on the income losses. And here in this graph, what you can see is on the X line, you can see average net monthly earnings according to economic sectors in the economy. And on the y-axis the average income loss due to short-time work in percentage points. And what we can observe, whereas the blue dots are the numbers for the Great Recession, and we can see nearly no relationship at all between the size of your average net monthly earnings and the average income loss. So it was roughly around 10%, 9% at that time period. This time we see a clear negative pattern that lower incomes had larger average income losses due to short-time work than higher incomes. So there are distributional effects related to the use of short-time work. Let me summarize. Overall, we find marked evidence for successful safeguarding of employment during the coronavirus crisis, also when compared to the Great Recession, and also when we take into account that the negative economic shock due to the COVID-19 pandemic was much more severe than the economic shock due to the Great Recession. Working time reductions play again a major role in the coronavirus crisis as well as in the Great Recession. In contrast to the Great Recession, however, short-time work was by far the most important working time instrument to safeguard employment. It was responsible for approximately 94% of the temporary working time reduction used to safeguard employment in Germany. Income effects may have been more severe in the coronavirus crisis than in the Great Recession. This is due to the fact that there was more short-time work than in the past. Mainly low-wage sectors in the service sector were affected, and we saw stronger working time reductions than during the Great Recession. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give the floor to the discussion. If you want to download and find out more about our paper, that is the link where you can find the whole paper.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm going to turn over the discussion to Phanindra.
Yes. All right, thank you. All right. I hope you guys can see whatever I'm showing you. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good, excellent. So thank you so much. I mean, it's a very nice paper. I mean, first disclaimer is I'm not an expert on German economy, you know what I mean? Yes, I do have a fellowship, a research fellow at IZA. I mean, then I've been to Frankfurt airport a number of times going to India. But anyway, it was a very nice paper, but let me tell you where we are going with this paper. So, so this is about looking at the German labor market, how it behaved, just with contrasting between what happened with in Great Recession and then also with COVID. So let me give you a quick overview. I think Alex did a good job, but I wanted to make sure that, so this paper compares, as I told you, about the Great Recession and COVID-19 crisis in Germany. So the focus is on much more on the intensive margin. So because he has these two programs like WT and STW, like short time to work, seems to be an effective tool to safeguard employment. But when you go back and when you look at there are still differences. But what they try to show here is that the short-term workers suffered twice as much as income loss than in the Great Recession. And then, and they also say that this has affected this marginal employment, but not really protected by STW. So what did they do? In section 2, they summarize the German labor market, how it is affected by COVID virus. This was a very, very interesting read for me because it just gave me a lot of ideas. I mean, like understanding about how the German economy is. So one of the things is they say that the rise in unemployment was much more faster and more pronounced than in the Great Recession from the plots he showed us. And there seems to be a measurable decline in the economic activity. And part was since people working in these mini jobs, and I have a little bit of a comment on that down the road, left the labor market for temporary reasons. So in section 3, they present a comparable business cycle analysis of these two recessions and the COVID recession. And then this is where they're trying to show us these working time instruments, how they affected the labor market during the pandemic. So here, let me be very brief. So this, when they talk about the internal flexibility at work, this is the very core of what is being presented in this particular paper. That when you go back and when you look, I mean, as Alex showed us, based on the plots he showed us through look at the recession for both the, I don't know which graph, I think it was the figure number 4. Then when you go back and when you see it examines the components of working hours per employee per quarter. So what has happened is this WTA was the second most important instrument in charge of internal flexibility during Great Recession, but played almost a very, very minor role in COVID-19. So what happened there, and the most of the focus was on this STW, was the main instrument to safeguard employment during COVID-19. Whereas all instruments, the difference is all instruments contributed fairly equally during the Great Recession, but whereas in COVID, it was more like the focus is on the short-term work. The short-term work policy changes were similar during the 2 recessions. Government, however, extended this short-term work scheme much faster during COVID-19. I think it has more to do with everything happening so quickly, I guess. Bear with me because I'm, okay, good. So the overview is, what are the things we focus on? They looked at the number of workers, the number of reduced working hours per short-term worker. And then one thing which we saw is that the COVID saw higher loss of time. During COVID, as I showed you, that SWT is used with greater intensity and applies to more workers in economic sectors with lower average earnings. So in section 4, they investigate the blind spots of chosen policies to safeguard employment, because you can blindly go out and use these things, and then they focus a little bit more on the distributional effects and some of the explanations they gave. So this is more or less the big story. So which is for a change, I read a paper where it's not that I'm going to regression after regression, whatever, but it was very well written and descriptive in terms of the analysis. So now with that backdrop, let me tell you some of the suggestions I have. So I would say that the readers could benefit well-rounded definition of this marginal employment, a little bit more explanation. And also I wanted them to incorporate a little bit backdrop of the German labor market during the time span, so that readers could gain more context of these comparisons between the Great Recession and then the COVID-19 pandemic. In section 3, you made an observation that WTA was the second most important instrument in charge of internal flexibility during Great Recession, but you said it played a very little role. But I went over and this, what are the possible explanations? Is there any story that can be told? I mean, why was not the case? And then plot 9, which is one of the last plots you showed us, only shows the negative correlations between income loss and monthly earnings. What about the causations? I mean, I have a little tough time. In other words, if I just go with the correlations and then treat them as causations, it's not going to be that easy. It also seems that you are making a very, very strong causal claim. I mean, in fact, from your paper, the lower the average earnings are in the economic section, the higher is the percentage income loss due to STW. So here, for me, you stated, but I don't know whether there's a causal link there. I mean, so what is it I want? I want some plausible evidence. I mean, correlations, whatever the stuff I showed you in the codes would be interesting to consider if you can tease those things out and see maybe what is really going on behind the scenes. So, but what happened is right after that particular thing, they do have, I need to give them benefit of doubt. The authors do explain in paragraphs that follow, including factors such as topping up of this STW elements in relation to the negative correlation between STW and income. However, in my view, the readers could benefit with the additional explanation that answer in more detailed question why STW was impacted the labor market differently during the COVID versus the Great Recession. For example, the following paragraph states facts and conclusions, but provides little reasoning. I did not state that paragraph, but that's in the paper. In section 3, you made an observation that WTA was the second most important instrument in charge of internal flexibility during Great Recession, but played very little role during COVID-19. What are some possible explanations? I mean, why was this not used as much as it was used before? So again, here one of the quotes from your paper. The differences between the two crises highlighted above will also have consequences for the income distribution in Germany in general. After the Great Recession, there was no sharp increase in income inequality, but rather a slow market increase in the subsequent years. However, at the same time, real wages have also risen for the large parts of the population in the subsequent upswing, making many people better off. So this was the quote you gave in the paper, and I was trying to see the relevance of this in terms of what you were trying to show us. So overall, it's a very interesting paper and compares, as I told you about these working time instruments, how it influenced the German labor market. But I still have additional questions that can be explored or included. For example, so here, given the fact that this COVID has impacted us globally, I mean, I just wanted to see whether there's any little bit of an international dimension you can look into. So one of the things I have is, can the use of STW be extended to the other countries to elevate recessions and their labor markets? And what about the countries that have policies similar to this STW in place in Germany? Because there was no mention anything on that front. Then how does Germany compare to those countries in terms of the policy outcomes? I mean, like, it's great. I mean, let me tell you, I learned a lot about German labor market, but I wanted to have a little bit of a context, because this is not a German problem. It is a problem we are experiencing globally. So one of the things I was trying to see where does this collective bargaining or unions, whatever, fit into this work? Is there any role they have to play? And then what about the findings you have, especially when you're looking at the short-term work? I mean, I don't know whether your findings are completely gender neutral. I mean, I have a reason. I mean, I feel like in terms of I don't want to use the word occupational segregation to make it hard, but I feel like could be some gender angle which we need to explore before I can take your findings. I mean, like in a way, but it's a very good paper. So one of the things I really want to do is I definitely want to thank LERA for this nice session, and Emily Smith, the executive director. And what I'm really hoping and praying is that we can all meet up for at least a cup of coffee for a meal in New Orleans in January 2023. So overall, it's a very nicely written paper. I mean, I like the paper, and but there are some of the issues I had. Maybe it shows my lack of understanding of German labor market, but I feel, but it was a good read for me. All right, this is all I wanted to say about the paper. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then hopefully you guys can, maybe Alex can respond to some of my queries. And what I'll do is I'll send you my slides to you. Okay, I'll just email you so that you have them.
Well, thank you very much for your feedback on the paper. Are there any quick questions that we might have for Professor Herzog-Stein? Okay, if there's no question, so we'll go to the next paper. And the next paper is the consequences of Medicare pricing and explanation of treatment choice. And the paper will be delivered by Elena Falcettoni. Elena, please feel free to begin, or she's already beginning, that's good. So thank you, Elena, and please proceed and have fun.
Thank you very much. I assume everybody can see my slides, but please tell me if not. So as you mentioned, I'm from the Board of Governors. So every presentation of mine starts with the usual disclaimer, and nothing that you'll see here today represents the views of my colleagues at the Federal Reserve Board or the Federal Reserve System as a whole. So what I'm trying to see about basically the fee for service. And fee-for-service matters greatly in the United States. And so fee-for-service, sure you're all familiar with it, but it's when you get paid according to the procedure that you do and not according to who you are. And it accounts in the US for about half a physician's income. And of course, that's actually more when the physicians are self-employed, because of course, then fee-for-service payments make up for an even greater share of their total income. Now, there's this fact that fee-for-service reimbursements for specialty procedures are higher than those for typical primary care procedures. And so, in other words, I will use a sort of examples throughout to guide you through this, but this is the same as saying that, running an EKG, just the fact of running that button, which takes 10 seconds, is paid on a standardized basis a lot more than a 30-minute visit at the primary care physician. Now, in general, we would expect this to be generally true, right? Specialty procedures might be more technical and require more expertise. And so you would expect them to be generally paid more. However, this gap has been widening over time, independently of other things. So this has been widening, even though, for example, certain procedures now take less time to be executed, or even though the level of specialty or specialty knowledge has not increased. So basically, in other words, they were always paid less, but now primary care procedures are paid even less so over time, and this gap has been widening. So again, the key component here is that fee-for-service reimbursements only depend on the procedure carried out and not on the specialty of the physician who carries it out. So why does that matter? Well, because of course, then this payment system generates a certain financial incentives for primary care physicians to substitute to more specialized and more remunerative procedures whenever possible. And so, in other words, you can think of many financial incentives that can that affect physicians, and many have been studied at different papers over time. However, what I'm going to focus here is specifically the urbanity margin, which is our urban or rural an area is. And why does that matter? Well, there's fewer specialists that practice in rural areas. And again, this is based in the United States, but really you can really run, if you think about where physicians are, even in other countries, especially like countries like Canada or Australia, they have similar issues. Fewer specialists are in rural areas, primary care physicians face less competition, and so they're able to carry out more specialty procedures. So in other words, if you're a primary care physician in a rural area, you don't have a cardiologist around, you're more likely to carry out the EKG. And if the EKG pays you more, you're more likely to do so. And if as the EKG becomes more remunerative, you have a higher and higher incentive to pick it up. All right, so in other words, what's the question I'm analyzing in this paper? Well, what I'm going to look at how the increases in the policy saturation rates, that's why I'm going to be basing on Medicare, for more specialized procedures, induce primary care physicians to carry out the procedures themselves rather than referring the patient to a specialist. And again, I'm going to focus on the urbanity margin with the idea that primary care physicians are able to do so more the more rural the area because of the lower level of competition that is coming from specialists in these areas. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the model. This is a structural model, and of course, we don't have as much time in this presentation, but I don't want you to necessarily get the details. I want you to get the feeling of what's happening in the model. So what I'm going to do and use as markets are MSAs and near combination. Again, I'm going to base myself on the United States patients. There are my I individuals have preferences that differ by demographics. These demographics are not just age and gender, but also risk scores that include about 40 different diseases and illnesses. So it's a really comprehensive index of their health status. And I'm also going to proxy for income and income squared. They're going to choose the patients, a choice combo basically, and this combination is going to be the procedure and the physician group. So this is the physician type basically that I'm going to call, or physician group, it's whether you're a primary care or a specialist basically. Choices are going to differ by the price paid by the patient, but every patient that I consider is going to be covered by Medicare. So actually these price differentials are going to be small. They're not going to matter that much. And then there's also basically controls that they include other things such as urbanity, which is going to be key. So this is actually what's going to look like. So there's going to be a utility of my patient picking that physician type procedure group in every market, which is the MSA and ER combination. And here what you see is that there's basically going to be a weighted sum of the utility of the patient to the utility of the primary care physician. And the key thing here is that the primary care physician is only going to be equal to this thing called the RVU. The relative value units are really what determine the Medicare reimbursement for each procedure. So just to give you an idea, basically every procedure is given this sort of objective measure in relative value units. Then they get weighted by different things. There's the combination of the procedure itself, the location and the office type, and the malpractice insurance. So there's different combos that then go into the final reimbursement. This is the part that drives the procedure specifically, and then and I'll talk about it a little bit in the results. So just I'll remind you what it is. So the important part here is basically the patients themselves who don't really proceed the RVUs, but the physicians only enter the utility through that. So they care about their reimbursement. And this is going to be what's going to give me the policy side, the sort of the policy shocks, because when the Medicare changes their rates, they change the RVUs. All right, so the patient maximizes the weighted utility. And again, the only way for the primary care physician to enter the utility is through the policy set reimbursement unit. And importantly, only the primary care physician can influence the patient's choice as in by the determining of referral. And then here where you see these gamma urban, which is what I'm going to show you at the end, these are basically, I'm going to use the census definition of how rural an area is, and it's going to give me how important the urbanity of the area is. Now, if you're comfortable or you use this clear choice model, so we've seen this clear choice model, so at the end of the day, this is going to look actually quite similar to any other discrete choice model that you've looked at. So there's going to be a patient's mean utility, a physician's utility within the mean utility, and it's going to be stochastic coefficients. And then here you see the observable characteristics for every physician and procedure combo are the P's and the X's, and then there's going to be an observable characteristics as well. So going forward, again, the only time that the physician enters the utility is if the physician is a primary care physician. And then again, these RVUs are the policy set reimbursement rates. And then the stochastic coefficients, you're going to have the observable characteristics for every patient. Those are going to be given by the DI. There's going to be the effect of the patient's eyes and observable characteristics of the two parameters. And there's going to be how the two parameters depend on the observables and unobservables of the stochastics. And then there's going to be the usual type 1 extreme value error. And so at the end of the day, again, if you work on these key choice models, and I know I'm going through this pretty fast, but at the end of the day, it's going to be a very sort of nice little formula that you probably saw before, which is the mean utility part, and then the individual utility for each patient with the error term. All right, so given that, then basically you get a market share for of J of that physician physician procedure combo for every patient of type I, and then basically using the empirical distributions of the demographic and unobserved characteristics, you can back out the market share of the physician procedure market combo. And so here's what you have. All right, so I know I went really fast, but at the end of the day, if you read basically the serial paper in IO, it's the same. It's not serial, but it's physicians and money and patients and procedures, but it's the same thing. It's you picking Cheerios, but then instead of picking Cheerios, you're picking an EKG by a primary care physician or a specialist. All right, so data, I'm going to show you a couple of data things before I walk you through the results. So I'm going to use the CMS data on the physician, Part B physician, and other supplier. I'm working on revising this paper, so in the latest version, it's going to go all the way to 2018, but everything will hold. It's just right now, that's how I did it originally. So the first thing, of course, you probably sort of thought about it as I was talking, is what is a specialty procedure and how do you determine what's a specialty procedure and what's not? And so the first thing that I did is that I calculated the frequency in the sort of universal procedures independent of where physicians were or who they were. And I looked at basically how often a given procedure is carried out by primary care physicians or specialists. And then I assigned the frequency as the level of specialization of that procedure. And then I focused on procedures that could be carried out by both physician types. Again, we don't care about those that primary care physicians simply can't carry out because that wouldn't be interesting. But then I want to focus on those that are normally carried out by specialists. Now, what I'm showing you now, it's gonna be a couple of graphs, but know that basically there's a whole robustness where basically this range can be varied, and all that's gonna change is basically the extent to which they can do it, right? So what I'm gonna show you, what I'm showing you right here on in front of you on the slide right now, it's two graphs. And here what you see is I'm focusing on procedures that are carried out by specialists 50 to 80% of the times, and the primary care physicians carry out the remainder 20 to 50%. And so in the graph to the left, you see the percentage of physicians that carry out these specialty procedures, and by physician type. So as you can see, the orange dashed one is the specialist, and the black solid line is primary care physicians. So here, what it means is that it doesn't matter how often you carry it out, as long as you carry it out even once you're counted in this graph. On the x-axis, you see the urbanity index. The larger the urbanity index, the more rural the area is. So you can see that in general, in a city, primary care physicians will carry out these particular types of physicians about 55% of the time, yet in rural areas, they carry them out about 90% of the time, and the reverse is true for specialists. Now, in the graph on the right, you instead see this weighted by the procedures. So this is the percentage of specialty procedures of these types that are carried out by each type of physician. And so you can see that 40% of the procedures of this type are carried out by primary care physicians in a city, yet almost 80% of the procedures of this type are carried out by primary care physicians in rural areas. So here you can see that even just in the data, you can see that the share of these procedures that are carried out by primary care physicians in a rural area really increase as this area becomes more rural. And now if you play around with the range, you'll see that as you narrow the range, so here you can see procedures that are normally carried out by specialists 70 to 80% of the time, so that primary care physicians only carry out the remainder 20 to 30%. The result becomes starker. And of course, the opposite is going to become true as you widen the procedure range, and therefore as you include more and more procedures that are more normally carried out by primary care physicians. But here, when you focus, for example, on the procedures that are usually carried out by specialists 70 to 80% of the time, you really see how stark this difference is, where primary care physicians carry these procedures out, about only 20% of these procedures in a city, yet they carry out almost 70% of them in a rural area. So you can see that really this is quite a stark fact in the data that, when I started working on this, I didn't know, and I always find very interesting. Like, I just find this graph very telling. All right. So then the next thing I want to do, because I want to make sure that I have enough time, is that I also then simply look at basically if there's a change in the procedure reimbursement, so a change in those relative value units that I showed you, increases the probability that primary care physicians will increase the number of specialty procedures of that type that they carry out. So in the example that I gave you before of the EKG, well, say that the EKG suddenly becomes more remunerative, well, then how likely it is that primary care physicians will increase the number of times that they carry out that EKG. And so in column 1, you see that there's about a 17% chance that primary care physicians will increase the number of EKGs that they carry out. And column 2 is frequency weighted. So in other words, those that already carry out EKGs will have a 46% probability of increasing the number of EKGs they carry out. So they seem to respond definitely from a pure reduced form perspective right away. So I'm gonna move over to the structure of results now, and then just discuss them shortly. And so here in this big one, you see the results from the model that I showed you. And so the relative case, the one that I'm comparing it against, is always the biggest category. So it's a big urban city. And here where you can see where I'm going to focus on the first column, all the others are robustness checks, but as you can see, they're very robust. You can see the increase in market share of primary care physicians that are in an increasingly more rural area relative to primary care physicians in a city, in a procedure that becomes more remunerative as it becomes more remunerative. So again, let's go to the example because it's always difficult to explain it. Well, say that the EKG suddenly becomes more remunerative. Well, primary care physicians in the most rural area are able to gain 12.3% higher market share in those EKGs relative to their most urban counterparts at the expense of specialists. As you can see, this effect is strongly positive as soon as you go away from the biggest cities, but is most important in small metropolitan areas and very rural areas. Now, I think that there's always a sort of this interesting point of view that comes out of this paper that I think is important and I personally really like. And that's the fact that there's a lot of studies in general that we talk about in health about overutilization, right? And often to study overutilization, we really focus on a particular case that we're examining. So for example, say that you are in rural Iowa and you follow a group of primary care physicians, and then you suddenly see that the EKG rate goes up and they were already all carried it out. And then suddenly they all carried out more EKGs. And in such a scenario, if you do this analysis, you will conclude that, hey, overutilization is there. But the interesting thing here is that what this paper also suggests is that there might surely be overutilization, that the pie gets bigger for everybody, but also there seems to be a reallocation as things get more remunerative away from specialists into the primary care physicians market. So in other words, if we just conclude that everything is overutilization, we might actually be missing important within market reallocations of a given procedure pie, quote unquote. And so I think that's also a very interesting point of view that that hasn't been explored as much, and that I definitely will want to explore more also in the future. Actually, I think I'm going to stop here. And if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'm happy to hear the discussion.
Oh, thank you, Elena, for your presentation. So I think we will now go to Jennifer, who is the discussant. And Jennifer, take it away. Oh, you're on mute.
All right, great.
I can hear
Can
you.
everyone see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for having me discuss this paper. I was very excited to read it. And I actually also study primary care physicians and Medicare. So I was particularly interested in this topic. So let me go ahead. So in summary, this paper studies primary care physician responses to increases in reimbursement. In this paper, PCPs can choose whether to perform a procedure or service for patients, and they can also choose to refer the patients to specialists for the same procedure. The paper focuses on the reallocation of procedures from specialists to PCPs for any given total number of procedures, and the paper also focuses specifically on procedures performed by 60 to that are performed 60 to 80% of the time by specialists and 20 to 40% of the time by PCPs. All right, so what the paper does is it prevents reduced form and structural demand model estimates that support the reallocation. The paper uses variation in patient demographics across MSAs, which also vary across time. And then the paper also uses the reimbursement rate variation across time, which also, I guess, vary across MSAs, but these are the major dimensions I highlight here. And the paper finds that PCPs increase the number of specialty procedures in response to greater reimbursement. Right. So the general comments I'll start off with are that there are a number of strengths and contributions. The paper, as Elena mentioned, dives into the substitution between physician specialty groups, and this may substantially affect labor markets between the PCPs and the specialists. Rural physician labor markets are particularly important due to physician shortages. Two major points I'd like to highlight is that one, the data is publicly available. So this is great for anyone who wants to study more about this topic. The data is available at the physician procedure year level in aggregate Medicare data, whereas a majority of the papers that study increases in reimbursement rates and so on use patient level Medicare data that's not publicly available and difficult to access. And the paper also uses a structural demand approach, which allows for patient heterogeneity across geographic areas. The main limitations of the paper is it doesn't address the overall supplier induced demand and the total number of procedures that are related to things like overutilization. And then the patient level demographic variation is slightly understated because the random coefficient, while it captures variation in average patient characteristics across physicians based on the data that's available, it doesn't capture variation in patients within physicians quite as much. Sorry, wrong direction. All right, and so now I'd like to just highlight the main context. The advantages of this traditional original Medicare context is that it's fee for service. The reimbursement rates are administratively set. So physicians aren't setting their rates or prices to the patients based on demand. Patients have the same insurance, except in cases of dual eligible Medicaid beneficiaries and beneficiaries with Medigap, but these are minor. And so Medicare is as homogeneous of a context as you can get. So this is the sort of what we would think of as like an ideal context for the study. The reimbursement rates, as Elena mentioned, depend on a number of factors. These include the RVUs, geographic adjustment factors, and a conversion factor that scales this total RVU to the Medicare budget. So I'd like to dive a bit into sort of what makes up these factors. So the reimbursement rate is sort of what I call the total RVU times this conversion factor. And this is all based on a procedure J, a geographic area R, and a year S, where T, the market in the paper, is an R and S combination. The total RVUs is based on sort of the work, the practice expense, and professional liability insurance or malpractice insurance. And these are all given RVUs and multiplied by their geographic adjustment factors. I'd like to highlight that specifically that the practice expense RVUs differ between facility sites and non-facility sites, which are what we think of often as offices and are listed in the data as offices. And I'll come back to that point later. And then the actual reimbursement depends on some modifiers to the procedure codes and also on what other procedures are given on the same day or visit. So there are going to be some differences in the prices that patients face naturally due to these adjustments. So now let me dive into the data a bit, because that's sort of one of the, the contributions of the paper is that it uses this publicly available data. So in terms of data, I want to know sort of what physician specialties are classified as PCPs and what physician specialties are classified as specialists. For example, is geriatrics a primary care specialty, or is it a specialist specialty? I also would like to see if the paper could focus on procedures primarily carried out by PCPs and specialists versus other healthcare providers, because this is sort of the main dimension of choice. For example, could we try to what extent our procedures focus on these two versus like other procedures also performed by, say, emergency medicine physicians, which would be sort of in a different setting. As I mentioned, the place of service can be sort of in facilities or in offices, and that's the breakdown in the data. And so facilities and offices differ in the average prices to patients, because patients who go to facilities may pay a facility fee that's not captured in the data. There's also differences in average reimbursement rates to physicians. And there's also differences in sort of like which types of physician specialists would be in each setting. So for instance, you might think of maybe there are more specialists in facilities, whereas primary care physicians maybe deliver the procedure more in offices. And so that will be an important point. And so for this reason, could the paper separately examine primarily office-based procedures and primarily facility-based procedures separately? Or maybe even could the paper focus on only office-based procedures to observe more complete payments from patients? There's also a couple points about the data. So procedures are classified in this paper based on they're defined based on their HCPCS or CPT codes, which are very specific and tied to financial components. And these can be actually grouped into what we higher level BTOS codes, which are more stable clinical categories that don't vary over time. And so in some cases, this is sort of based on my understanding, PCPs and specialists might bill with different HCPCS codes for what we think of as the same procedure, sort of the same procedure as like attaining a certain purpose. And so I'm wondering, could the paper report or use BTOS categories to improve our understanding and interpretation of sort of what's going on and to sort of avoid the substitution of different HCPCS codes based on who's delivering the service? And finally, procedures are given in cells of data by physician year, and Medicare requires at least 11 procedures per physician per year, which is the cell, for inclusion in the data. And I'm wondering if the paper could focus on more common procedures to avoid undercounting procedures. For an example, if a PCP delivers only 5 procedures of this HCPCS codes, it's not going to be included in the data. So now I'd like to focus on sort of the second component of the paper that is a major contribution, which is the structural model setup that it uses. And so just to reiterate the structural model assumptions, the choices between whether PCP or specialist performs a procedure where the specialist is the outside option. The choice is not based on physician reimbursement except through this PCP's utility term. And PCPs and specialists have the same reimbursement. And so as I mentioned, this is contingent on them having sort of the same, HCPCS code and the same geographic area, since if a specialist, is going to be in a different geographic area from where the patient visits a PCP, the reimbursement might actually end up being different. And so my questions related to this are, how are non-MSA urban areas or non-urban areas matched to MSAs and markets? And how should we think about specialist prices? Since as specialists are the outside option, their prices don't quite enter in. And then I'd like to just highlight a couple points about the estimation. So the paper is able to incorporate demographics, except the data is given sort of at the physician level. So this relies on the assumption that PCPs make decisions based on, their average representative patient, not the average patient that receives a specific procedure, or the marginal patient that PCPs would refer out, say, to a specialist. The paper uses per capita income as a sort of a patient characteristic. Is that actually based on the physician zip code, which is sort of the only zip code I could find in the data? And then also, I was thinking that because different PCPs perform different numbers of each of the procedures, when we're drawing the patients or the patient characteristics, should they be weighted by the PCP's number of procedures? The paper also uses instruments. I won't talk a lot about that because prices are pretty much exogenous in this context. And then finally, in terms of weights, I'm wondering if the observations could be weighted by the number of procedures, by the procedure, MSA, and year combination, just to get a better sense of what the overall impact is, since MSA is different in size. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about some of the main results and interpretation. So here, the main results are that for one reimbursement unit increase for a given procedure, the outside metro PCPs gain 7 to 15% more in market share versus specialists than metro PCPs do. And PCPs gain more market share in small metropolitan areas and in rural areas. So my question is sort of, why are the results larger in small metropolitan areas than in micropolitan areas, which are between the small metropolitan category and the rural category? And also in terms of understanding the magnitudes of this total effect, sort of what's the aggregate effect in terms of total Medicare spending that's reallocated across the procedures studied? And I'd like to end with some broader comments that may be more relevant to future work. So as I mentioned, one of the limitations of the paper is that we don't see the total increase in procedures. And I mean, I understand that this is paper focuses on the substitution, which is something that's, I think, is understudied. But if we were to allow for an increase in procedures, for example, if an increase in reimbursement increases number of patients with the procedure and the marginal patients are at lower risk than average patients and only the higher risk patients visit specialists, then we would also see more PCPs performing the procedure, but not more specialists performing the procedure. So that's sort of an alternative mechanism. There are probably others as well. And I'm wondering if in this line of work, if we could consider procedures for which we sort of know or could approximate the denominator of patients. For example, in preventive care, where we have a defined pool of patients who should get it, or maybe in preoperative testing, where we know sort of how many patients are getting some operation, and there's, maybe some testing that's directly associated with it that we can identify. And then in that case, maybe we could define sort of the outside option as no procedure. And I'd also think that something the paper could do is to understand the extent to which PCPs substitute away from other procedures, such as their normal primary care procedures, or do they change their total output? And that's something I think that the paper could do with the data that's already here. And that is actually related to sort of what I'd like to end with, which is sort of future research and policy relevance. As Elena highlights in her paper, this affects physician labor supply a lot. And there are shortages in physician labor, particularly in PCPs and in rural areas. I'd also like to understand more broadly sort of what is the effect on healthcare quality and on health outcomes with the substitution of some of these procedures from specialists to PCPs. And then finally, what are some potential efficiency gains? For example, if a patient could get a procedure with their PCP, they might not need to, have a separate office visit with the specialist. And, that separate office visit will increase spending. So there could be efficiency gains. And sort of the overall sort of observational evidence is that in some cases, patients who visit PCPs who do more actually have lower spending, but that is sort of very observational. And another point of efficiency gains is that specialists might be located further away from patients. So if patients are able to get the care they need from their PCPs, they may have some reductions in travel, which could improve patient welfare. So I'm looking forward to seeing more research related to this area and hearing Elena's comments. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Jennifer, for your comments. I will now open it up for any comments from anybody. Feel free to jump in whenever you need to, or whenever you like. And
okay. Okay, can I ask a couple of questions to Elena, or you want to respond to Jennifer's comments, Elena?
Well, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First, Jennifer, thank you so much. Please send me the slides because I couldn't even keep up. It was great. And it has a lot of great points, and I can get back to you on a couple of things, but some of the stuff that you mentioned is definitely also doable and stuff that would improve the paper. I will say that especially at the end when you mentioned other areas of research, like the physician and labor shortage is literally, this was actually my third-year paper in grad school, and this was the reason that I studied the determinants of physician's location choice as major market paper, because it literally, that was exactly the thing as I was doing. I was like, primary care physicians must realize this as they pick, and exactly that, as in you do different things, and therefore your reimbursement part definitely varies according to where you're gonna end up. So that's definitely something that I'm looking at, as well as the part on the impact on health is something that I've been working on, but that's definitely a little bit more difficult to disentangle the pure quantity effect from the quality effect, which is pretty much the issue, right? I mean, you don't necessarily, like one of the things that actually come out from my other paper, the determinants of physician's location choice, is that because of the way that the policies are set up right now with a heavy weight on loan forgiveness, you end up with a lot of physicians that are from lower ranked places. They go to rural areas because they have a very high loans and they don't have access to top jobs. And so that's like one of the parts, right, where you kind of start thinking about it and you say, well, if you also end up there and you end up doing more procedures, right, you might have the quantity, which helps the shortage, but do you have the quality? And that's not, it's a very much more difficult question to answer because of the mix of patients and the fact that sicker patients tend to travel farther and things like that. But yeah, no, thank you so much, Jennifer. This was fantastic. And I know that you did the swap last minute, and I can't believe how much you managed to get out in this last minute discussion. So thank you so much. And yeah, if you have other questions, please.
Yeah, okay. So the thing is, I live in rural Vermont. I mean, like, we do have a community hospital, and most of the major hospitals are about 45, 60 miles away from us. So what happened is, one of the things is, even though PCPs do a lot of whatever, not very heavy duty procedures, but they do, but these nurse practitioners have become much more an important part of the healthcare system here. So in a way, I'm not saying anything less about them. So where does they fit into this storyline you have? And then I have one more follow-up question. So what we do in Middlebury, Vermont, where I live, some of these specialists, even though they're far away from us, the hospital has a very nice arrangement where those specialists come like once in a month or once in 2 weeks or whatever. I'm not even kidding. What a difference it made in terms of the community, because all of a sudden you're not making this person to go whatever that far, because some of them may not be able to drive, whatever may be the case. So in terms of the storyline you have, so where does anything like these things, is this some kind of a very unique thing that is happening in rural Vermont? I don't think so. I have a feeling that there are a lot of other places also you do see these nurse practitioners and specialists stepping in to help out. So
yeah, so nurse practitioners are not in the storyline that I showed you right now. Nurse practitioners are not primary care physicians because they're nurse practitioners, and importantly, primary care physicians are only bound by ethics, by what they can do, but nurse practitioners are bound by law on the physicians on the types of procedures that they can carry out. However, if you do analyze this same thing, and this relates to one comment Jennifer had at some point, and you do the same thing in terms of restricted primary care procedures, and you look at the exact same thing of the non-medical personnel, so nurse practitioners, and you look at primary care physicians, you will see the nurse practitioners take up more of the typical procedures that are carried out by primary care physicians in urban areas, in more rural areas. So as you can see, it's sort of it's almost like primary care physician is the new specialist in rural area, and nurse practitioner is the new primary care physician. However, one important difference, and so I do have a very preliminary work that I'm working on for nurse practitioners, is that the scope of their independence really varies by state and also over time, because some states have made them more independent over time in the last years. And so nurse practitioners cannot necessarily do everything and do it without a physician in every state. So one of the interesting things that I'm looking at, or at least I think it's interesting, and it's preliminary work that I hope to have a preliminary draft for this year, is that I'm looking at the fact that as they become more independent, there's also, even if you look at it, nurse practitioners that become more independent are more likely to go to areas that have shortages. So they're also more likely to go into rural areas. So a priori, if you think about a person, so if you think about yourself in Middlebury, Vermont, and you had nobody and the nurse practitioner comes in, you say, that's fantastic, I have care, and we should also be really happy about it. However, if a primary care physician is actually good at carrying out the specialty procedures, if the primary care physician had moved in, you would have also gotten the EKGs, but the nurse practitioner cannot do that. So in your mind, if you think about it, ex ante, you're happy, but the primary care physician still doesn't necessarily want the competition from the nurse practitioner. So when they go and pick their location, they now might go elsewhere to avoid the competition from the nurse practitioner. So ex post, you're worse off because you would have gotten care for both your primary care and specialty needs, but you actually only got your primary care needs. So from a purely perspective of understanding how much care you're getting, it's not clear whether that's a good intervention or not, even though I'm all pro nurse practitioners are extremely great providers of care, but it's an interesting thing when it becomes when it really comes to this sort of granular markets where it really matters how much market share you can have in the different procedure for a physician to live. On your second question, if the specialist is billing with an actual sort of office from wherever they're staying in that moment, I would observe that you have a different location and that you're there. If you don't, then of course I wouldn't be able to perceive that. Now, the interesting thing I think that is important is also that can be done for regular checkups, and that's important, and it's something that I think should be, considered more and a lot more as an intervention. Australia has a wonderful setup of flying doctors, and they're actually exactly what you're saying. They fly in for regular specialty care in very rural areas of Australia, and it's been a fantastic policy that has had incredible health benefits for the population, and it's something that I think should be it will make it the population better off if there was more of that. And it's something that I've been discussing as well. I was recently at the Stigler Center at the University of Chicago, had a healthcare conference and symposium where it's gonna, there's gonna be basically sort of these ebooks that are gonna come out of that. And this is something that definitely I was discussing and addressing. And I think there should be, more interventions of that kind. I don't think they're as widespread as they should be, and I don't think they're as organized as they should be at the moment. But yeah, so this is a little bit of 2 cents. My third cent that unrelates to this paper, but since we're talking about, sort of shortages, it comes out on my, other paper, The Determinants of Physician's Vocation Choice, is actually foreign doctors. Foreign doctors are extremely important, foreign trained. The problem is right now we don't have as much basically policy that helps them go where they need to go, but they being, when they're allowed to go there, when they're able to get a visa, they're shown to go in shortage areas. They actually help a lot of the vulnerable populations, and so they are a really, really key component of the medical workforce. But right now we have a very strict caps on the visas for physicians, and so that's also something else to think about. The
only thing is when you talk about a foreign physician, case in point, I know somebody in Vermont. I mean, they had a very little experience in India. I mean, then St. Albans, which is very close to Canada, they didn't have like a physician or whatever. So he was brought in such a short term with a green card. And we were amazed to see. And the thing which bothered me is he was there for about 6 months and then he jumped the ship. But that's besides the point. Anyway, thank you.
There's often a lot of restrictions anyway on what you can get. So I think that was a very specific case, because usually the US doesn't like giving lunches for free, and that's definitely proven in policies for physicians.
I had a quick question that came to mind as you were presenting. I'm just a medical consumer, so I really don't know anything about the marketplace, and that ultimately was why I had the question. We have this phenomenon happening here, at least in the eastern coast of Massachusetts, where we have specialists that kind of like have like houses or small businesses that just do this one procedure. So what I've experienced are endoscopies. So we have like these endoscopy centers. And then I know it also happens with dialysis. There are dialysis centers. And I'm just wondering, how is that business classified? Is it classified as a specialist, I assume? Kind of how does that fit in the in this analysis? Like, because it seems to me kind of weird. It's not the same thing as like a specialist physician versus a PCP physician, if that makes sense.
Well, as I sort of, the main point is that the procedure itself is not classified as a specialist or primary care physician. It's all about who carries them out. And it's all about, it would appear in my data set if the patient that goes there is on Medicare Part B. So if that goes and there's Medicare Part B and it's, basically the equivalent of a physician in an office setting carrying out that procedure, it would appear as such. And if the physician is a specialist, that would observe the specialty of the physician, and if it's a primary care physician, same.
Okay, so
and again, of course,
that gets to the point of, that kind of gets to the point of the question, in that these businesses now I don't know, I only know my local area, which is the South Shore of Boston. Okay, so we're we're kind of large suburb, metropolitan kind of feeder area, but these businesses, there has to be a supervising physician, but they are the people who are actually doing the procedure are, not physicians. They're just trained, nurses and stuff like that. and they do, over and over and over again, the exact same procedure. So it's literally the only thing that you get done is an endoscopy at this business. So I wonder, this phenomenon may be small enough, it may be something that's only happening in my local area, but I'm wondering if that kind of changes the dynamics of the analysis, if this is happening. Does that make sense?
So yeah, so I think what you're talking about is simply like if there's somebody doing who carries out the procedure versus who interprets the procedure are two different people basically. And in that case, there are certain modifiers in the billing where it could be the technical side from the interpretation side versus doing both. So there is a little bit of a separation on that. And as I mentioned, for this particular part that I'm doing, and as I said, I did do the partners practitioners, but it's not even in the paper right now. It would be if there's a component that is carried out by the nurse practitioner that's removed. So that or the physician assistant wouldn't enter because that's not a parent care physician. Now, if you're also, your other question is also how can, would it be a specialist doing this 50 billion times? I also think that probably the specialists that are related to those labs actually have also an office where they do other things. And this is one of the things that they do. So, there's that as well. But that's my 2 cents. Now the specific, I don't know the specific business model or exactly who they are, but that's what I would get out of it. There are labs within the Medicare data, but that's usually other stuff. It's more like like blood work.
Awesome, thank you.
We're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I would like to open up for any other questions that anyone might have on the 3 papers that were presented. So whether you have nice comments, complaints, or anything like that, feel free to jump in.
I just want to say a quick hello to Alex. I did send my slides to you, okay?
Oh.
Okay, thank you.
Or any other questions, comments, complaints, or anything else?
Well, we need to give you high marks for running a good show.
Yeah, I hopefully next year we'll meet in New Orleans. So I think that would be kind of fun.
Oh, all right, coffee on you, okay?
Okay.
All right, folks, can I excuse myself because I have to go a little snow shoveling, okay?
Okay, have a good rest of your day. Well,
Okay, thank you.
I guess if there's no other questions, comments, or anything else, I guess we can depart. And I'd like to thank LERA for putting together this session. I'd like to thank Bernadette for her help as well. I apologize in advance for my camera issues. I don't know what happened. Maybe I have to go back on the phone for the rest of the conference and wait till figure out what happened to my camera. So, the Zoom world we've been living in.
Time for a new computer, okay?
Yeah.
Just kidding.
So anyway, well, I guess we have 8 minutes left. So I can still open it up for any quick questions, comments, or anything before we go. Okay, I guess not. So I guess we'll get ready for the next session, which starts at 12:15, I believe. And so I am ready to go. So have a good rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.